Welcome everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're located. We're very excited to get this webinar started and give it a moment to let everyone get connected. We've got a really great program here in front of you as we're going to cover what is really a hot topic right now is the changes and things that are going on with SMS and the different regulations, the different way things are being scrubbed out, the different challenges you face with registration. We just want to welcome everyone and appreciate you taking the time with us today. But before we get started, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. First off, this conference is being recorded, and we will be providing access to the session recordings after the conference. Second, during the conference, if you have any questions or comments, please utilize the chat function on the conference control panel. There will be a Q&A at the end of each presenter's session where we'll be addressing as many questions as we can, and our team will be replying to the comments through the chat as well. The webinar is intended to be short and sweet, and we want to address common concerns or questions surrounding using compliant SMS communications for debt collection efforts. The agenda for our webinar today consists of some really great people that we've been able to bring in to help you answer the questions. I will give it just a couple more minutes for everyone to join in before we get started. Got a lot of people, it's a really good response in wanting to address this topic. I've been hearing a lot of questions and issues as things, the big challenge that I'm seeing, and we'll get it as we get into our to our panelists today. We'll get into the question is, it seems like the goalpost is constantly moving on what we need to do to be able to keep things compliant, to be able to keep that registration going, being able to keep your campaign SMS campaign going. And we're very confident that we've been able to address a lot of those questions, and we're having a lot of success. So we hope we can answer any questions that have come up for you. And I'll take a moment here and introduce to you some of our panelists that we have today and addressing these questions. And right now, the agenda for our webinar today consists of Mark Brennan, a partner of Hogan Lovells law firm, Joshua Plowd, CEO and co-founder of Apeiron, and Mike Borden, senior account manager at TCN. And like I mentioned, throughout the process, please use the chat tool to ask any questions. At the end of each section, we'll address those questions and hopefully get them all answered for you. To begin, we're going to start with Mark Brennan. We're excited that he's able to join us today. Some of you might be familiar with him from past webinars. He's a great resource for us in being able to really understand the landscape, the legal landscape, and what's going on in Washington, and just all those challenges. As I mentioned, Mark Brennan leads Hogan Lovells' Global Technology and Telecommunications Industry Sector Group. He's also the lead innovation partner responsible for championing innovation in client service, new products, and legal innovation across the firm's global business. Mark has a truly unique global regulatory and policy practice that makes him a valuable resource for clients across industry sectors. An experienced advisor, Mark is a respected voice on privacy and communication matters, and his thoughtful strategies empower clients on matters spanning from regulatory consultations and rulemakings to compliance and product design to government investigations and enforcement. As a reminder, we encourage everyone to participate by asking questions in the chat, and we'll answer them as quickly as we can. Mark, I'll go ahead and turn some time over to you and let you answer some of these questions that have come up and cover what you're seeing happening in the landscape today.
Bryce, thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Bryce. Thank you, TCN, for having me. And really happy to be here with everybody. So as Bryce mentioned, we go through some of the latest developments over at the FCC and in the States, and then we'll leave some time for questions. So we're going to cover a variety of calling and texting developments, and something helpful to keep in mind as we go through are that you'll see an overall trend of the obligations, the legal framework getting more and more complex and lending itself well to ensuring that the partners that you work with have the capabilities to help you manage the different consent frameworks, opt-ins, opt-outs, time of day, different calling records and record keeping. So just keep that in mind as we talk about some of these obligations that are coming through the pipeline. All right, so next slide. The first development, this one we've touched on before, but the effective date is rapidly approaching. So I want to make sure that we cover this today and that we save time for any questions on the FCC's pre-recorded calls decision. So bottom line for this one, we're focusing on a change in the rules for pre-recorded or artificial voice calls to landlines where it's not marketing. So informational or non-marketing, pre-recorded or artificial voice calls to residential landlines. No change in the framework for marketing calls, no change in the framework for auto-dialed calls, no change in the framework for calls to wireless numbers. Only a change when you're placing non-marketing, pre-recorded artificial voice calls to residential landlines. So before the FCC decision from this actually dates back to 2020, and then they released an updated decision at the end of last year. There used to be an exemption that allowed you to place pre-recorded artificial non-marketing calls to landlines. Now, in light of the FCC's recent decisions, there's a limit on the number of those calls you can place without consent. And that new limit is up to three calls per 30 days. Beyond that, you need to obtain prior express consent, similar with the TCPA's other consent requirements. So again, change in the rules becomes effective soon. You can place up to 3 calls per 30 days to residential landlines using a pre-recorded artificial voice. So again, non-marketing. Beyond that, you need consent. Next slide. So make sure that for any pools of numbers that you have for which you're placing calls to landlines without consent, that you have a mechanism to track how many calls you're placing, when the calls were placed, manage against 3 calls per 30 days. And that's not a calendar month, it's a rolling 30-day period. So keep track of when day 0 or day 1 resets. Alongside this, to the extent you rely on the exemption from the consent exception going forward, so to the extent you're placing up to 3 calls per 30 days without prior express consent, this slide has the additional compliance requirements. You have to provide a phone number in the message so that individuals can call back and make an opt-out request. This would be, of course, if they receive the message on a voicemail or whatnot, and then they call you, they need to know who to call back. And then on the message as well, this is more if they're answering the call in real time, but the message itself has to include an automated, interactive, or key press opt-out mechanism so that they can easily opt out during the call itself. So the key press or interactive mechanism plus the phone number for them to call you back in case it went to voicemail. Both of these are required now, but only to the extent you rely on the exemption. So just to run through a scenario, again, we're talking about pre-recorded artificial, non-marketing calls to landlines, service calls, debt collection, and other non-marketing calls. You can place up to 3 calls per 30 days without obtaining prior express consent, but then you have to do the things on this slide. And then beyond that, you need consent. Where you have consent, and for any pools of numbers that you've been calling based on having obtained prior express consent, these new opt-out requirements don't apply to you because you don't have to do these, but because you obtained consent, remember that consent can be revoked. So you still have to allow people to opt out if you obtain consent, but these opt-out requirements are only where you're relying on the exception to place up to 3 calls per 30 days. Like I said, it's gotten more detailed. Next slide. July 20th, so a little over a month away. starting July 20th, you'll need to have operationalized the opt-out requirements and tracking of the 3 calls per 30 days to the extent you rely on that exception. Next slide. So that was the big one on pre-recorded or artificial calls. Some other developments happening at the FCC. They have several proceedings moving simultaneously with respect to call blocking as well as text blocking. And for a variety of reasons, the frameworks are not the same. Calls typically have been more heavily regulated. The carrier experience has been more heavily regulated. And historically, the default had been that carriers had to allow voice calls to be delivered. They had to deliver anything that was in transit. There was no carrier discretion to block calls. That has changed in the last few years, and carriers now have certain abilities, and even from the FCC, certain requirements to block certain calls. And that has created a number of side effects for legitimate callers that are getting swept up in some of the blocking. On the texting side, the default flips. Carriers have historically had the ability to manage their texting traffic on their networks, and so they have been able to block traffic. What we are seeing as a trend line at the FCC is the FCC is starting to get more prescriptive with the types of blocking that are required. So creating a baseline for blocking that carriers can go beyond if they like. So we'll walk through these different call and text frameworks in turn. And then, as Bryce said, we'll pause for questions and walk through any scenarios you want to cover today. So on the call blocking side, you'll remember there was the bipartisan Trace Act legislation from a few years ago, and it created this framework that sought to address the carrier and legitimate caller issues. So voice service providers may block certain calls based on their analytics findings, but then if they, and the idea was not to block legitimate calls, but Congress was concerned about scam, fraud, spoofed, unlawful calls, and so forth. So carriers can block calls, but they also have to provide the ability for legitimate callers to have their calls unblocked and obtain redress. So the details of that are still being worked out. And this has become a dispute centered around the zip codes that are used to notify the callers of the blocking. The FCC is in the middle of a proceeding on this, but just so that people have a sense, the working framework is around an upgrade to zip code 603. There had been a focus on shifting the zip code 607 and 608, but 603, the carriers are working with Addis and others on a way to add some enhancements to 603, which is currently used for other purposes, so that you would have more clear notice that the call was blocked by the carrier because the analytics or other reasons, rather than the other reasons that 603 could be, that to find out what was going on with the call. So 603 centric, but it does seem like this is going to spill into next year at this point before there's clear notice, which means that for anybody that is potentially subject to some of the carrier blocking, the only way you really know upfront is by actively managing your right party contact and other call connect statistics. So if you see what looks like an aberration in some of the call patterns and some of the outputs, some of the right party contacts and so forth, it may be that one or more of the carriers is blocking some of the calls from getting through. So keep an eye on that because the business team will be in the first instance the most able to flag for you that there could be a problem on the blocking side, and then work with your partners to check in with the carriers and get those calls unblocked. Next slide. Text blocking. So this was not something that we were focused on and saw the FCC focused on 5 years ago, but the environment has changed. And earlier this year, the FCC issued a decision that has required carriers to block texts that are considered highly likely to be illegal. And to give some context to that, there is the order establishes the framework for a do not originate list, and that would include invalid, unallocated, or unused North American numbering plan numbers, and then also North American numbering plan numbers for which the subscriber to the number has asked that text purporting to come from that number be blocked. So it's somebody that's a legitimate subscriber to a number, but they've noticed that somebody else is pretending to be them, is pretending to use their number, and so they've asked that text be blocked. Sometimes this happens when somebody has been only using the phone number for voice communications, and then a fraudster is spoofing the text capability on that number, and so they've asked that carriers recognize the do not originate flag for that. So going forward, carriers are expected to block text, so not deliver the traffic, that are considered highly likely to be illegal. Again, invalid, unallocated, or unused numbering plan numbers, and the ones where the subscriber has requested a do not originate for that number. There will be some side effects from the shift to this blocking, this expanded blocking, and there's still nuances around the scope of the texts that are considered to be highly likely to be illegal. And as a result, the FCC required carriers to offer a point of contact for erroneous text blocking. In many instances, this will be the same entry point as for the voice blocking. So you just start there if you're not otherwise seeing a contact. But working within the ecosystem, I think you'll start to see more consolidated lists of who to contact for different carriers. Next up, as part of that order, the FCC also issued a follow-on, so next slide, further notice. So this is an active proceeding where they're seeking comment. The comment and reply comment window just closed this week, but there is time still to put in other ex parte filings and so forth. But they're seeking comment on additional blocking that could be prompted by outreach from the FCC. Now, this seems a little haphazard, but the concept being if the FCC starts to receive intelligence about scammers and fraudsters using particular phone numbers for the texting, the FCC could reach out and require a network level blocking of some of those numbers. Another one that's more focused on marketing text would be a decision to extend the do not call registry requirements, which are focused on, those only apply to telemarketing calls, but extend those to texting and not just calling. There has already been some guidance out from the Federal Trade Commission, which runs the registry, that they believe that at least some of the requirements already apply to text, but the FCC would sort of shore up its own rules on this and apply the do not call requirements to text. Now, one thing, those rules were not drafted with texting in mind. So to the extent the concept here is to add the protections and so forth to texting, I think there would be a number of things to work out on how you fit some of the disclosures and and the like into the typical text 160 characters. But the FCC would have to work that out. But there does seem to be momentum that calls and text should be at least treated similarly with respect to those telemarketing requirements, but operationally, there's going to be a lot for them to work out. And then finally, for anyone on the line that is connected into the lead generation business or relies on multi-party consent forms, the FCC is looking to prohibit the scenario where one consent form allows multiple parties to call. So you see this sometimes for anybody that's reached out for home contractor services or for bank loan rates. Often you fill out one form and they say like, we'll share this with our partners and you'll get multiple offers. It would create tension with that particular business model and require more of a dedicated one consumer, one seller parent for the consent forms. So this one, the FCC just saw a comment. They will need time to review the record, but you could see something on this proceeding moving later in the year. Okay, and then next slide. Tomorrow, the FCC is going to consider another item focused on the calling and texting environment, and again, updating some of its TCPA rules. So the first, the do not call requests and consent revocation, they would propose, and this would be launching a comment round, so it would be open for public comment, 24 hours to honor the stop request, basically. So do not call request or consent revocation, you have 24 hours. Require carriers to honor those texts from wireless carriers to their own subscribers, honor and opt out, allow consumers to revoke their consent through any reasonable means, and then also confirm that when somebody opts out from texting, you can do that one-time opt-out confirmation receipt message. Some of this is already the framework, but they would move some of this into the rules rather than just a prior decision. And then finally, over to the states, next slide. Just one brief point on Florida, which had been setting the bar for most restrictive state for telemarketing calls. They had passed an amendment to their state law after the Supreme Court's TCPA decision on the auto dialer issue. They sort of brought everything back into play for Florida and then made it even worse from a caller perspective. But just a couple weeks ago, the governor signed some amendments to the Florida telemarketing law to narrow the auto dialer issue, reduce some of the calls in scope, give callers more ways to demonstrate consent, give you a cure period for different texting issues. And they also made the requirements, the changes retroactive to help address some of the class action litigation that had been popping up as a result. So Florida is now in a better place from a caller perspective, but still a lot to sort through, and always important to be looking at the 50-state strategy when you're looking at compliance. So that's been the last few months and really active at the FCC, and then we had a lot of content to cover. Happy to take questions from anybody.
Mark, I really appreciate it. I know that it's a quick time to try to cover a lot of topics and information. There's a lot going on. I appreciate you giving us some insight into the most recent events going on with everything out there. I guess one question that came up, and it's covered pretty much, but is there, when it comes to TCPA consent, is there any real, can you compare and contrast the difference between phone calls versus text on that? Is it essentially the same, or is it getting to that level? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's getting to that level. And I think what's gotten harder is to design around doing certain, I think it's gotten harder to assume that what you design today will be the same framework next year nationally, which in my view means it's helpful to be working with partners that can accommodate different consent preferences and consent frameworks in different parts of the country, or can change as your business model changes, and looking at opportunities there where, for example, you may have one consent approach for certain types of calls based on a risk analysis for those calls. And then you might have a different type of consent approach for other calls. You could see a difference, for example, on the expectations between marketing calls and non-marketing calls. But as a general matter, the calling and texting expectations have really started to align. So a lot of the things that companies have been doing for years on the calling side are increasingly expected, whether by the FCC, states, or even carrier industry practices on the texting side.
And that's pretty much what I'm seeing is the carriers is wave with SMS. You're having to show clear, obvious approach to how you're getting that consent, how you're capturing it, how you're keeping record of that, screenshots, everything showing that it truly was an opt-in. So they're really pushing that.
And one thing the carriers have been very direct with in the past few years, especially after the Supreme Court's auto dialer decision, is that they have the ability from the FCC to manage traffic on their networks, and so their view is that even if the TCPA may not restrict certain communications, that that they can choose which whether texting should have consent expectations and so forth. And so the trend line from the carriers has been to expect consent across all traffic from message senders who are not just sending consumer traffic. So whether it's marketing or informational texting, the carriers, just as a collectively, there's variation from carrier to carrier, but the carriers have trended towards heightened consent expectations for all traffic.
Perfect, thank you. I appreciate it, Mark. And as the questions come in, roll in, we'll make sure we get those over to you as we move on to our next section. We appreciate you taking the time with us and always giving us some great insight of what's going on in that landscape of the legal realm of this. We'll go ahead and move over to Josh. Thank you, Mark. Appreciate your time. And we'll move over to Josh Plowd with Apeiron. Josh is the CEO and co-founder of Apeiron, a CPaaS platform that delivers best-in-breed voice, messaging, and video products. In 2014, Josh played a vital role in creating a software-integrated cloud communications service provider and has been consistently growing the company ever since. Josh, we appreciate you as well taking the time with us. You've given us some great insight as to what's going on everyone's, I keep repeating it, but everyone's really trying to figure out how do we make sure that our SMSs get delivered, what's that process, and and it changes. So I'll go ahead and let you jump into that and help everyone understand where we stand at this point.
Thanks, Bryce. Appreciate it, and thank you to TCN for having me, and thank you, Mark, for the last presentation. Definitely some things in there that resonate, and we'll touch upon stuff. Oh, great, to show my screen popped up here. So we'll get going on the presentation. Is everything being seen okay?
Yes, that looks
title screen
good.
of PowerPoint. Okay, great. So today I want to talk a little bit about the operational aspect of getting going with application to person SMS. What's happening out there today. Bryce, you mentioned moving of goalposts that's represented in here and a few slides back. We see changing environment, but there are some things that are fairly consistent and, things we can hang our hat on and, operate along a path that is highly successful in being able to integrate application to person SMS communications as a tool regarding customer interaction. So we will talk very briefly about application to person SMS messaging history and the timeline. It kind of sets up a little bit about where we're at now and some of the motivations or influences that we see out there with the mobile network carriers. A big thing is expectations. So we'll talk a little bit about what questions we'll address and set up what are realistic expectations to have when considering or operating, working with SMS. We'll talk about what's achievable. Definitely look at the registration process because that's really central to getting SMS messaging into production and being able to sustain successful operations using SMS. We'll talk about what happens post-registration and now that we're sending, what are the things that are being seen, what are ways to keep that operating efficiently and in a productive manner. And then we'll just do a quick wrap up and open to any questions if that's part of the format. So application to person, we've had person to person out there for a while. Short codes came around in 2006. That was a application to person, method of sending messages. The first in 2013, toll-free numbers had messaging enabled, and they were always application to person, so they were formatted that way. In 2020, the first true framework, I'd say, or format of local phone numbers supporting application to person came out. And fairly recently, 2022, we have enforced registration and carrier surcharges, and it's really a whole new environment for application to person. Prior to having an established framework, there was a lot of application to person traffic that was mixed in with person to person, and the carriers, were really trying to identify how there was, methods of abuse that were happening, and really message flows that weren't designed to be supported the way that they were. So it's really a different environment today now that we have this established framework to get, application to person traffic authorized without, going the short code route. That was always supported application to person. But now that we have the long codes, the toll-free numbers, and the local phone numbers, carriers supporting that, and being able to assist in the process of getting things situated to be able to send. Very high level, what the process looks like. This is a very simplified view. We're going to register. The network is provisioned. There are hubs, places that messages go through, particularly we're talking about toll-free, that are central points that have to be provisioned, hops along the way, and then most importantly, the mobile networks. These are all areas that have to be provisioned. More and more flow through with that. So it's, a faster process than the registration process. And then, from that point that we're registered, network's provisioned, we're in what we call a clear to send status, and it's blast off, ready to go, start sending messages. So we'll look at that a little bit and focus on registration because that's a major piece as far as getting going. So let's set up the expectations. We get this question asked quite a bit. What should we be able to do with application to person SMS messaging? So we're gonna set that standard or answer that question. What is a realistic expectation going into things? Is what you're trying to do going to be supported? What's involved in obtaining approvals? We'll look at the registration process and talk about how to situate yourself for success there, and also what it means to be registered and how that will support you moving forward as we get into the post-registration process. And then what to expect now that we're in production, we're sending messages. What are the experiences, and what are some of the methods to use SMS to continue to be effective as a tool in communications. So our goals, what's realistic? Let's assume that everybody is going to be a compliant operator, so that you set that aside. We're going to do the things that are needed at whatever point in time that the regulators require in wherever the messages are going to be compliant. What is achievable? And we kind of set this up as a, there's a concept that's really important here. We answer this question to say that, you will be able to send messages from a brand or sender that's been identified, that has been provided clear and conspicuous consent. And I think, Mark referenced the carrier operations and their view of things, where consent is expansive across all of the different types of SMS communications. Certainly see that. If you start from a point where you say, I'm going to have consent for everything that's being sent, then you're in a good position to be able to support SMS messaging. The other really important part of it is that when you send a message, whomever is the person that the recipient is interacting with has to be identified. So that's really important, that if you're saying that I'm sending you a message from McDonald's and this is a coupon, McDonald's is the brand that has to be registered. You have to register using the information of the brand, the entity, the person, the company that is going to be identified in the message. So you set up your registration process like that, but provided you're sending messages that are identified appropriately from the sender perspective, and you have clear and conspicuous consent, then as long as those messages are not prohibited content, you're going to be able to be successful in getting registered and maintaining SMS operations. So prohibited content, the standard ones that have been around, your sex, hate, alcohol, firearms, tobacco. More recently added cannabis, gambling, affiliate marketing, and high-risk financial services, which is probably the largest gray area that's there. Different interpretations around that. And I know that third-party debt collection comes, into question. Is that labeled as high-risk financial services or not? And it's really about the approach, what type of messages are being sent, and how are you using SMS. We'll talk about that a little bit. But provided you're messaging in ways that are supported from a brand that is the person communicating and authorized to communicate with that end user who has the consent, then you should be good to go. And getting registration and maintaining effective SMS operations should be possible. So if that's a reasonable goal, provided we're not operating within explicitly prohibited content. So the registration process, really big in know your customer, meaning who is the person that's sending messages, what that company is doing, how they're obtaining consent, are they verifiable as a company, and is there a solid reputation in public records? These are all things that are part of registration, and all A2P messaging involves this now. So this is a really important part, is providing the information that's needed to get your company identified, so that you can move on to discussing the use case, providing content, and getting approved. Local numbers is the 10 DLC registration process. We would use terms like brand and campaign there. Toll-free numbers has a different process, verified sender. And short codes is a per carrier application process. So that's not a standardized process, but you really see the influence in the current registration framework from where things started with the original A2P messaging and short codes. Just highlight some critical factors in these, or important components. Local numbers, there's a heavy emphasis on public records. So how trustworthy is your brand? Does your company have a 20-year history with a D&B record? Are there any complaints that are identifiable in various databases? Does your address match your EIN? Things like that. So there's a fairly high degree of automation, and a lot of times it's hey, if this validates, then your trust score is set accordingly, and that will play into the capacities that you're able to be approved for your use case. Toll-free numbers are a little bit different, less emphasis on public records, less automation and approval, and it's more in demonstrating your consent and opt-in processes, your message flow, and the call to action that is used to obtain consent. So there's a little bit more visual demonstration there. A lot of the concepts are the same, whether you're describing or you're providing screenshots or attachments to the process. They just require some different things because it is different organizations that execute the validation. And the interesting thing with short codes is that you can see that long code registration essentially came out of the short code application process. The formats that were required, you have to start a message with the organization that's sending the message. You have to identify the program that is being used. So brand and campaign, organization and program. There's really convergence in the process amongst all of the modes of SMS operation. So you can see that there are different requirements, different places those go, but the concepts are all the same. So preparing for that, really in any of those sets you up for success. So common issues in the registration process. This one's fairly wide. You either have inaccurate information, your address doesn't match a corporate identification number, so a flow-through verification can't happen. Something that's inadequate, like the content of the message, maybe your use case is okay, but the way that you formatted your sample message, this is what I'm going to say, doesn't have your identification, or uses terminology that puts you further towards a restricted use category. So getting your information in place pre-registration and making sure that it aligns with expectations and best practices is always going to shorten the timeline. Missing or conflicting information is also another thing that's out there, and we have seen more of a manual process implemented, even really the last several months of this year, where the approval process has people who are going out and looking at things that aren't part of the registration process. So, if you provide some information that conflicts with what's available on your website, and that's something that somebody is looking at, then that can cause an issue, slow things down, require some explanation. So those are things that it's good to get in line and be aware of what the expectation is. So we'll talk a little bit about that at the end, how to set up for success in this process and eliminate any of the speed bumps that you might hit there. Public records issues, if you have an organization that has had lawsuits filed against it, this is something in public records verification that is going to have an impact. It won't exclude you, but it might impact your capacity. So that's something that can pop up. Your record is your record, so you've got to kind of live with that with the company that's being registered. If there are any black marks or things that would impact the view of things from public records. Timeline, manual reviews. I think what we saw in the registration process when the framework came out was that there was now a way for people to get approved, and you had things that should not be approved that were going through automated processes, and you've seen sort of a backtrack on the process to say, wait a minute, we got to slow this down. We can't just verify public records and then because there's information that matches in a database, allow people to start sending several 100,000 SMSs a day. We maybe need to review things a little bit more closely, make sure that things match. I think there was some holes in the process that manual review has been put in place to patch, and we've seen some backlogs there. You also had implementation of requirements. So at one point in 2022 and 2021, toll-free and DID, it would help if you're registered. Then it became it's required to be registered. Messages aren't going to be able to be sent if you're not. And then all of the applications came in, and we saw times where there was backlogs that were fairly significant, and you had to work through those. So less now, but they still do occur and need to be managed. Manual review curveballs and moving goalposts. So something that didn't come up last week or last month that's now coming up in a registration process this week. We expect those. We're situated to deal with those. If we roll back to the expectations and say, I'm operating in a compliant manner, I'm identifying my brand, and I'm operating from a use case with sample messages that create an expectation that I should be able to use application to person messaging, then we can address these things. So all issues can be overcome. You want to have some flexibility, really in responding to questions from the mobile network operators or the hubs that are doing the approval process. You kind of understand where the request is coming from. And sometimes you can shift and accommodate something that comes in. Sometimes you need to dig in and fight. These things can impact timelines, so you got to kind of rank your priorities on what's most important. But there are ways to manage that registration process to be effective in getting campaigns and use cases approved. So sending, we're registered, we have numbers, we're clear to send, and we are sending SMS and MMS messages. This means that the networks have been provisioned. They recognize your phone numbers. The sample messages are available for reference. It doesn't mean that if you deviate from your sample message, then there's automatically going to be blocking. It means that the registration process has information that can be referred to. And insofar as each individual network has programmed elements from the registration process into their network, they are now looking at messages and responding to those. All of the networks are doing different things. A big one is capacities. So you get approved for a capacity, particularly in the local phone number environment. And those are things that will be enforced. If you're allowed to send 200,000 a day to T-Mobile, then they will block if you go beyond that. If you're allowed to send 10,000 a day to T-Mobile, you would see blocking at those levels. So there's some of the clear-cut items that come out of approval that are programmed in. But then there's the things that are out there that are operating that you can't really account for in the registration process. Sending is disconnected from registration. So while you're in a defensible position to say, I'm doing everything that we said we were going to do, anything can happen, and you increasingly have algorithms in play out there that are looking at certain velocities, that are looking at certain keywords. False positives abound. Anything can happen. So, really, you want a baseline performance. You want to measure trending. You want to look at results, and look to identify any issues. So, you could be doing exactly what you said in registration, and response rates end up, going down because somebody has gotten a block in place. I lost my screen here. Is that? You still hear me?
Yeah, we're still there, Josh.
Okay, there we go. Okay, sorry, the screen popped up in front of me. I thought I lost the PowerPoint. So just a couple more slides here. Sending, so remediation of blocking and filtering is doable. And if we are doing the things that we said we were going to do in registration, then we're in a defensible position. So registration's your friend. You could be being blocked. It could be because of a keyword. You can then open a ticket with the mobile operator and say, look, this is exactly what we told you we were going to be doing. And those blocks and filters end up getting resolved fairly quickly. A really important part of it, though, registration's your friend. You're defensible and you can address issues, but complaints and opt-out percentages are going to trump registration and even compliant behavior. At the end of the day, mobile operators are going to be more concerned about their customers complaining and will take actions that they feel they can support based on regulations allowing blocking and management of traffic. So, you got to be prepared to deal with that if you have high levels of opt-outs, if you have high levels of complaints. So there's, things that you might want to do to stay away from, regular complainers. There's litigator lists, there's, do not call lists, there's, things that you might want to do to stay away from, people who might raise issues, even if you are operating in a fully compliant manner. Now, the interesting thing here, we talk about the registration framework and the what became a carrier surcharge framework. This is now something that carriers are being compensated for. They have their carrier surcharges within the application to person framework. They have implemented surcharges. This is part of them putting the systems in place to manage registration and the provisioning of the network. It's not, probably more significant than their customers complaining and, creating issues for them, but it is something where they are being compensated, and it is, something that's hitting their financial statements at this point. So it is much more of an established process and method of communication going through those networks. So there is that in your favor, that they like it a lot more now than they did when they weren't being compensated. Other things you can look at is parallel and intermodal strategies. So, managing local numbers as well as toll-free, managing different types of campaigns and getting things to be more granular. So, there are strategies to, make sure that if there is something that happens, maybe it only happens to a segment or a particular use case, and it's not impacted across all of your campaigns and methods of communicating. So, we'd say that operational implementation can be effectively executed. The only clear-cut issues are if you're in the prohibited uses. Anything outside of that, provided you're operating in a way that the registration process and the networks agree with as required, you're going to be good to go. Where there's a will, there's a way. So as we talk about any of the areas where you get into someone might interpret something as a high-risk financial service, or if we're dealing with a third-party debt collection, there are ways to format the messaging and the campaigns to be optimally effective there. So there are ways to achieve your application to person SMS goals unless you're squarely in a prohibited use. I think you definitely want to have a good partner to assist with, things like compliance, the registration process, and ongoing results management. And I'm not sure if our format allows right now. Bryce, do you have questions, or are we opening up for questions available for
We'll
either?
do it at the very end. We'll cover anything and cover some of the questions. We'll move over to Mike here in just a second. Josh, I really appreciate the information. I really appreciate you being a great support with TCN as we've navigated this landscape with the SMS. I think the great summary here is that we are having success. Our clients are continuing to be able to send text through either long code or toll free. We've come together with a pretty clear, concise process of what it takes, what's the information that's needed to be able to get that registration done so that you can go ahead and continue to do those SMS. So reach out to us and we can help align you with what it is that it takes, what are those steps necessary, because we are having the success. And if I understand correctly, Josh, with the toll free, if all the paperwork's in alignment, those are coming through pretty quickly to 3 to 5 days for registration with that. Once we have all the proper paperwork, I think the long codes are taking a little bit longer, a couple of weeks on those, but we could, it's all a matter of just following these guidelines that you've outlined to be able to get the process approved, and we can make it happen through our various clientele. So I appreciate it. Any last comments there? I'll move over to Mike and get into the TCN side.
Oh, good to go. Thank you.
Josh, I really appreciate it. I'll turn the time over to Mike, our senior account manager, to take you a little bit through some of the processes and things, the tools we have set up in the TCN platform itself in order to help you keep track of the things that are going on and make sure that this process is successful. Mike, go ahead and turn the time over to you.
Great, thanks, Bryce. So let me do this. I will share my screen, and you guys should be able to see the TCN system.
Yes,
so
see that.
Today, I just want to real quick go through what's available within TCN at the moment, based on what everyone talked about. Pretty easy, honestly, for the most part. TCN has the ability to initiate those outgoing text messages. If you utilize our omni-channel functionality, you have the ability to manage incoming text messages as well. It's really just a matter within your TCN system to go into the Omniboss menu, to go into a project, and to set up SMS campaigns. Me personally, I have an inbound campaign that I can manage. I also have an outbound campaign that I can manage. The outbound campaign is set up very similar to the P3 campaigns in the sense that you can have your texts per hour, you can have your text message, anything you load in the file in through the LMS process can be inserted into the message. So everything can be personalized, it can have information in it. You really can make your text do exactly what you needed to do on a campaign by campaign basis, even on a file by file basis. And you can always include at the end reply stop to opt out. Now that will reply stop, that'll add that phone number to the TCN do not call list. That'll also add that phone number to our carriers do not contact list. So for text messaging, they have the ability to stop or start those text messages back up. Now, once you have that all set and all ready, you can also utilize TCN for your consent list if desired. That is actually done through our natural language compliance suite. We have a consent menu down the bottom here, and that is where you can actually load up your own consent file, because most of you are taking care of your consents list. You have your contracts, you have your opt-ins, you do it through a verbal notification and you notate that in the CRM, or you have that through your web portal. So you can use this process just to load that file, or you can actually use this process to embed in your own web portal. So here I can copy a link and I can place that into my own website, and this ties directly into the TCN consent list. You would then have to construct and configure the appropriate compliance rule set to reference this list. You have to determine what if somebody's not on the list. You have to determine what type of communication, but this is built in where you can say, I'm allowed to call, or I'm allowed to text, or I'm allowed to send an email, and actually have the person enter in this information. Again, you can also upload files through the consent list, so you can do that outside the system and still tell TCN what's going on. Now, there is another way for the consent file to be managed. That is actually through the agent interface. When an agent is logged in, they can click on the consent form and they can search the consent, or they can add to that consent, very similar to what you just saw from the actual consumer perspective. Now, the conversations, as I mentioned, with the Omniboss sending out the information, going through and sending out the communications, is the initiation of the text. You can set up the TCN system to have an inbound campaign that if somebody were to text that number back, they could call it back and we could route it to an external number or to an agent logged into TCN. But if they were to text it back based on the skills you have associated with the timeouts you have configured, you can actually have those texts route to an agent that is logged in if that agent is working in our digital channels. So if that agent were logged in and waiting, they could have that text communication. So they could have it set up in such a way that if I have a text message and say that was right party, we can close that out. And then we can have another conversation that goes to that text message number. So if somebody sends me a text, I, as an agent, will see that new text coming in, and I will be able to interact with that text message. If I still have a text running. So here, no, I still have a text running. It's great. I can see that text from my management dashboard. I can see that is new. I can see that is not assigned. I actually, from the management perspective, can click on the message. I can download it. I can also view the conversation. So if I don't have an agent responding, I can jump in and say, thank you for contacting TCN. And I can take over that communication. I can even transfer it to another agent if the initial agent didn't pick up on that text. So those are the options that are currently built into TCN. Your ability to send the outgoing text message, your ability to interact with an incoming text message, your ability to upload a consent file or to utilize the embedded link within the TCN system to manage that consent file. You do have reports. You can see here that I can download this conversation so I can see what occurred. So on a conversation by conversation basis, I can see that. I can also go into my business intelligence menu and I can look at the dashboards and I can see information that summarizes that. Things like the total conversation by channel. I can see the average handle time. I can see if there's any closed conversations. Realistically, if I went back over the past 30 days, these insights look much better because I have obviously more data over the past month. You'll see these conversations. You'll see who handled the conversations. You'll even see some efficiencies that are here. All of that is currently available. All of that is built in. All of that can be discussed with your account management team. It all does base on you getting a source number and you going through that registration process, as Josh mentioned. The cell phone carriers, they really have complete control at this time. We are here to guide you and hold your hand and walk you through the process, but that's what you're looking for. You're looking to get that number. You're looking for us to procure that for you or to port that number to TCN for text messaging purposes, and then for us to work with our carriers to get that registered so you can actually deliver your text messages. And then it's just a matter of determining what pieces of TCN you want to take advantage of. Bryce, was there anything else you wanted me to touch on or any questions come in?
No, perfect, Mike. That was a good end cap to everything that we've covered today. I think the general concept here, and I reach out to everyone out there, as questions come to mind, typically for me in any of these things, it's the next day, whatever questions that I didn't think to ask, reach out to us and we can get to either one of the presenters, to have them answer it accordingly. The key comes down to, as we've seen, as Mike just mentioned, the carriers individually. You've got AT&T, Verizon, and Sprint. They all have their own individual rules and processes that they've implemented. So it's a different landscape per carrier, and it is kind of continually changing. And so we've got a team that focuses on what's going on and establish those relationships as to whether you want to use a toll free, whether you want to use a long code, whether you want to use a short code. We can implement any of the above. They all have their pros and cons, but there is a process, and you're going to have to maybe change some of your practices to be able to make sure that you were able to get that approved. But through both our support systems that we presented here today, both with our vendors and also with the TCN tool itself, we give you the ability to be able to control the consent, stay on top of these things so you don't run into any challenges with the delivery. Mike, appreciate your presentation. Appreciate everyone today. Mark, Josh, and Mike for taking the time, and we appreciate everyone to join us today. Go ahead, send us an email, reach out by phone if you have any follow-up questions as we try to help you navigate this challenge. It's coming up. I'm getting calls daily about how do we do this. Maybe their vendor no longer is allowing them to utilize SMS, and we've been able to take people in that situation and go through the process, help them see the check marks that we have in place to be able to get that put in. But it does take some time, and we can work you through the process. So I appreciate that. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is being recorded. We'll get that available just as soon as possible, and get to the information and answer any questions that might come up afterwards. Appreciate everyone joining us today, and have a wonderful day, and hope to talk to you soon.